Hello, my friend. Welcome back to the club. How are you today? My guest today is one of our recent graduates from the School of Christian Health and Nutrition. Stacey completed her Christian Health Practitioner certification about a month ago. And I remember reading through her application before she even started the program and thinking, I want to have her on the podcast when she finishes. Stacey is an herbalist and a student of traditional Chinese medicine. And I remember being so curious about what drew her to the CHP program when she already had this training in other areas. At the same time, I was incredibly glad that she felt led to join us. And I knew that I eventually wanted to pick her brain about how all of this fits together. And then recently, I was talking with Cristal, whom many of you already know from previous episodes. And she mentioned that she had actually hired Stacey as her CHP to help her navigate some complex health issues. So Cristal was Stacey's mentor group leader while she was in the school, which is how they first got to know each other. And I just thought, how cool and how amazing is that one of our veteran CHPs is reaching out to one of our newer CHPs with this special background in herbalism to help her work through some things. It's moments like this that just make my heart so happy, seeing the work that God is doing through the school, the people he brings to it, the unique callings he places on each person's life, the way our practitioners are helping friends, families, and clients pursue better health, and the community that he's weaving together through all of it. Honestly, he just continues to blow my socks off. So today I have the joy of welcoming two outstanding Christian health practitioners. Welcome Stacey Cirillo and Cristal DuBois to the Christian Health Club podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. This has just been going through the school and everything. It's just been so exciting, and to be on your podcast and be here with Cristal is truly a blessing. So I'm just grateful that you invited me here today.
Yeah, so happy to have you. You want to say hi, Cristal?
Hi, everybody. So happy to be here.
Okay, Stacey, we're going to start with your story. We'll make our way to the work that you're doing with Cristal, but we have a lot to cover because I have so many questions. So let's start with you telling us about your background and what ultimately led you to study herbalism.
Yeah, that's a long story. It started when I was very young. I've always been so drawn to nature and just curious about everything. Like, what is the purpose of everything? I love laying in the fields, gazing at the clouds, just smelling the plants. It was my safe haven, especially when my parents were separating. So the seed was planted in my childhood. I remember sitting in my elementary class and just gazing out the window, wishing I was on the other side of the glass, because that's where I always felt I was meant to be, to learn and grow, where my real teachers were waiting. I was a very quiet and shy kid. I was always just listening, because nature is always teaching, and God was giving me a quiet understanding about the world around me. So, later on, my dad told me he used to think that there was something wrong with me because I hardly talked. However, when I went to school, I did really well. So I guess I was okay, just a little different. And I always resonated with the passage in Job chapter 12, verse 7 through 10. And it says, "But ask the beasts, and they shall teach thee, and the fowls of the air, and they shall tell thee. Or speak to the earth, and it shall teach thee, and the fishes of the sea shall declare unto thee. Who knoweth not in all these that the hand of the Lord hath wrought this, in whose hand is the soul of every living thing, and the breath of mankind." God shows himself through every detail in his creation, and it just leaves me in awe. So anyway, it would be decades before that seed would be watered in me again. I couldn't ignore my heart forever. I went to college. I did the thing we're told to do. I became an environmental scientist in 1999, several years before having children. It was the only career path that would put me outdoors at least part of the time. And shortly after 9/11 happened, I learned I was pregnant with our first son. And by the grace of God, my pregnancy saved me from being sent to New York City during the anthrax scare. So I was on a list to be sent, and I didn't want to go. So I was just so grateful. And then a few years and a few babies later, God revealed to me to homeschool our three boys. And in doing so, I got to see everything for the first time again through their eyes. It would eventually allow me to go back to the woods and the fields and remember who I was, where my heart felt at home. We planted gardens, we grew our own vegetables. My husband hunted, we raised chickens, had goats. So it was ultimately when my youngest son and I learned bushcraft and survival skills that I really began to study the plants and foraging. And God was just opening my eyes. It was like a reawakening, and it spoke so loud into my heart. He just kept showing me how these things were made for us. On day 3 of creation, God brought forth all the herbs, trees and seeds after their kind, where the tree of life stood in the beginning. So when I read Ezekiel 42 and Revelation 22 about the healing tree, the tree of life, that will yield 12 manner of fruits each month, and the leaves will be used for the healing of the nations, that just puts the most beautiful picture in my mind. By God's grace, everything comes full circle. So I always felt I was born in the wrong generation until I realized, like Esther, I was meant for a time such as this to bring herbs back to our remembrance. So I've been studying herbs for almost 7 years now. I've attended several herbalism schools, and I really learned from such amazing herbalists. I've been in clinical training for 3 years and practicing herbalism in my community for just over 2 years now.
Wow, that is such a beautiful story. It truly is. I love that. Well, why don't you kind of explain what is herbalism and what does an herbalist actually do?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this because I think herbalism is somewhat misunderstood. It isn't just about giving out plants for this issue or that. A good herbalist will focus on the entire person, their past, their current situation, their future, lifestyle, diet, mindset, their dreams, even their faith. The idea that we can use herbs to suppress a symptom really doesn't work. In holistic herbalism, we treat people, not the disease. And first and foremost, a herbalist is a forever student of nature, which in my opinion is the best job ever. In a clinical sense, we look at the whole person. Herbalists have to know a specific constitution of the person as well as the energetics behind the disease or disorder. Herbal medicine is powerful, and it has the potential to really rejuvenate so many aspects of a person physically, psychologically, and emotionally. A super important aspect of being an herbalist is having a solid understanding of the whole plant and understanding the application beyond what it's used for, to know the core property of the plant that informs you why it is used for a symptom or a condition, and most important, to do no harm. And we also have to keep in mind that everybody has an innate and assumed constitution. Our innate is what we're born with, and we continue to have that throughout our lives. This is our predisposition to disease and psychological temperaments. And then the assumed is acquired through lifestyle, diet, environment, mental and emotional patterns. So this is a critical piece of information that modern medicine tends to ignore completely. Another aspect that commonly gets overlooked by is the constitution of the organs, the systems and tissues. And this is done through energetic classification, such as hot, cold, wet, dry, tense, or relaxed. This is key to whether an herb will work or not. So for example, a person with a cough, and we have many herbs for coughs. And we want to look at the specific cause of that type of cough. So is it a wet cough? Is it a dry cough? Is it a racking cough? In order to match the precise herbs, because, you can really, really aggravate somebody. You can make the cough worse if you use the wrong herbs. So this method of looking at the whole person is very similar to traditional Chinese medicine. The Chinese physician will focus his attention on the whole physiological and psychological individual. So for example, if someone were to break their arm, if they were angry when the accident occurred, they're going to address not only the injury, but also the emotion that was behind the injury. So ultimately, the goal of an herbalist is to have people live a life where they feel vibrant and healthy in their body, to have a clear mind, peace in their heart. It's so important to connect to your heart and soul where your true purpose lies. Your soul directly influences your mind and your heart, and where all your human experiences impact you psychologically. So what is happening in your body directly corresponds to your mind and what life is teaching you.
Oh, amen to that. That's amazing. I'd like to talk about traditional Chinese medicine because I've had people ask me over the years, my thoughts, is using TCM, is it Christian? Should I be wary of it? And so I'd like you to just go a little bit more into that, explain the principles, and then how would you answer that question?
Yeah, sure. So part of my training as a clinical herbalist does incorporate traditional Chinese theory in order to recognize patterns of disharmony. So it's one of many tools we use. It's not the only one. So Chinese theories have evolved over thousands of years through trial and error. It's one of the oldest continually practiced forms of medicine in the world. It's roughly 5,000 years old. So unlike our Western approach of treating a symptom, a Chinese physician organizes signs and symptoms into an understandable configuration in order to restore harmony in the individual. So the ancient Chinese perceived humans as part of one unbroken wholeness, and they call it Tao. And it's just a way of thinking that predates the separation of mind from body and man from nature that Western culture developed in the 17th century. Do I think using it is Christian? Well, my heart looks at the mechanism in which the system was developed. They developed their art by studying nature over thousands of years. They were studying the working of the master artist, the one who made heaven and earth. And the interplay of nature is really not so different from the workings of the human body. So we learned about this in the Christian School of Health and Nutrition, how our gut is like a garden, for example. They focus on how to interact with qi, or life's animating force that we call energy, and how to cultivate and guide that. So I honestly feel it's more in line with the principles of health that God outlines in his word more than our Western approach to health. I think with anything, you always must pray for discernment. We live in a fallen world and we can ask that question about many things. And I know that nature is a key component to our health and well-being. The theory, though, I think that most people are familiar with in TCM is yin and yang, that ultimate symbol of perfection. All things are divided into duality. Yin and yang transform each other like day transforming into night. And interestingly, balance in TCM represents stagnation or lack of movement, death, and not actually representing health. So they see the body as a microcosm of the macrocosm. Nature is always changing, and health is defined as the ability of an organism to really respond appropriately to a variety of challenges in such a way that ensures equilibrium and integrity. So disease is really the failure to adapt to these changes. And Chinese refer to certain diseases as being generated by dampness, heat, wind, cold, that affects the qi. So the concept of qi, which is associated with life and all processes that characterize life, is the invisible substance, that energy again. So basically, the resources a human consumes, like food, transforms and transmits into energy. So without getting into too much confusing detail, the qi, which is yang, moves the blood, which is yin. So every day we engage in the world with work and family, and at the end of the day, we retreat to rest and sleep in order to replenish that energy or qi. And most of us are familiar with circadian rhythm times. And these are when Chinese organ systems peak throughout the day or night. So symptoms that appear and disappear regularly during different times of day correspond with this ebb and flow of qi. And so according to the classical theory, the most opportune time to intensify or strengthen qi is prior to the peak period. So before it gathers full strength. For example, the stomach and spleen are at their peak function between 7 a.m. and 11 a.m. And this is the time of optimal digestion and assimilation, which helps explain why the first meal of the day is so important for maintaining adequate energy. This applies to seasonal rhythms of ebb and flow. And seasonally, the best time to strengthen the lung is during the fall. The liver is nourished in the spring, and the heart in the summer, and the spleen in the late summer. So what your audience may find interesting is in Chinese medical theory, it does not have the concept of a nervous system. However, they believe that emotions play a major influence upon health and disease. So the nervous system equivalent would be the Chinese heart. And there is a quote from Sun Si Miao, I'm sure I'm butchering that name. He's from the Tang dynasty. And he talks about emotions being the cause of disease as pernicious influences of excess or deficiency, and that people suffer illness because they do not have love in their life and are not cherished. So the way we define organs are quite different from the West. For example, the Chinese spleen is most closely related to qi because of its intimate relationship to blood. The spleen is considered a vital organ of digestion, nutrient absorption, and blood production. So basically, it plays a key role in transforming food into energy. It's the primary organ of digestion. So the organs are discussed in reference to their functions and how they relate to other organs and parts of the body. So the spleen is interconnected to the heart because the qi energy is passed on to all other organs through the heart. So think of the heart as a monarch to all other organs. It's the source of wisdom where spiritual transformation takes place. So physiologically, the heart governs blood and vessels. And we know the heart is the first functional organ to develop at 3-week gestation. And research for the Heart Math Institute has shown that the heart has its own unique form of intelligence. And we know that God can transform hearts. And when you allow your heart to be your guide and set your intellect aside, there's so much you can perceive through nature and the Holy Spirit.
Wow. That was an incredible explanation. So much to unpack here. Where do we start? Okay. Well, one thing I was thinking as you were describing that is how we just use different terminology. Like when you were talking about ATP, I mean, you weren't talking about ATP, but I was thinking about, the energy that we make from our food, and we call it ATP, and we call it, we learn about the cellular respiration process in the school, and they call it qi and the making of the energy and how it disperses through the body. So I think, a lot of it's just maybe different language. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's just a different way of explaining things. It's just the culture. I think it's just a cultural difference, but it's pretty much the same idea, I think.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. Okay, let's go back and talk about meal timing and how digestion is strongest between 7 a.m. and 11 a.m. due to the stomach and spleen function. Well, but even before that, let's just talk more about the significance of the spleen as a digestive organ. I think that's so interesting because it's not one that we focus on really at all in functional medicine. And, like the way I was trained, we don't even consider that part of those primary digestive organs. So that's something different. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this because this is actually something we identify quite often, when we look at the tongue. We refer to it as spleen qi deficiency. So we already know about the spleen and its role in energy production. So the spleen is involved in the movement and transformation of water in the body. And if the function of the spleen is working harmoniously, digestive powers are strong. So if there is a disharmony, the whole or part of the body will develop deficient qi or blood. So if digestion is affected, one may experience abdominal distension, pain, diarrhea, or a change in appetite. So spleen is also responsible for decision-making, clear thoughts, and harmoniously engaging in the world. So if unbalanced, a person may worry easily, have difficulty making decisions, or be mentally unclear. And that's where you can see that gut-brain relationship. So the spleen is also responsible for keeping blood flowing in its proper path. If it loses harmony, it can lead to things like vomiting blood or blood in stools, uterine bleeding. Many chronic bleeding diseases are addressed through the spleen and TCM. Muscle tone or appearance of limbs also can indicate a strength or weakness of the spleen, as it transports those nutrients via the qi and blood to the muscles and flesh. And this is why, eating to strengthen the Chinese spleen is very important. So many people suffer from the spleen qi deficiency, especially fatigue and many chronic digestive issues that are being experienced in our standard American diet today. In this case, you want to avoid raw foods most of the time. And if you have a weak digestion, you want to avoid it year round. So focus on warm cooked meals that are health promoting to the spleen. Include root vegetables, as they are very supportive, herbs and spices that facilitate digestion like cinnamon, black pepper, turmeric, ginger, garlic, cardamom. They're all also excellent additions. I like ginger or fennel for a nourishing tea to the spleen. And then damaging foods are, your breads, pastas, milk, cheese, ice cream, and, processed sugary foods.
Yeah, all the delicious things. No, I'm just kidding. It's interesting that you said, though, raw foods can be hard on a body if you suffer with poor digestion. I think a lot of people think you have to raw food harder, when you're trying to eat healthy, and that's not always appropriate. It's a misconception that raw is always better, but that's not the case, particularly for somebody struggling with digestion. Another thing I think about with the spleen is how it is such a good source of iron. I know that I have recommended using beef spleen supplement for someone who is low in iron, and it's a great source of also B12 and folate and zinc. So what are your thoughts around that? Is that something that you would recommend?
Yeah, this is a great question, Chelsea. One that I have been navigating for quite some time because, especially coming from being a vegetarian, there is no denying that organ meats and bone broths are so nutrient dense. My grandparents always ate organ meats. Our ancestors ate the whole animal. And not long ago, a third of our protein sources were organ meats. So, when we only consume the muscles, we have a different distribution of amino acids, which can overstimulate the mammalian targeted rapamycin, or it's called mTOR, which may increase the risk of cancers and excess inflammation. So mTOR is a protein kinase complex, which acts as a central sensor for nutrients, energy, and growth factors to regulate cell growth. And when we have more bone broths and organ meats, we no longer have this disproportionate distribution of amino acids, and there is less stimulation of the mTOR. And another important reason to include organ meats is you'll have more retinol, as you said, B vitamins, coenzyme Q, which is a completely different nutrient profile. So you don't need to have it all the time. Maybe once a week, or at least consider including these things occasionally. And then there's some dispute over whether supplement or whole food form is better. If you have grass-fed meat, the source of the animal's diet, I believe it's the optimal way to go. God packaged everything in such a way to make it the most bioavailable this way. But if you don't want to go that route, I think supplementation would be a great option.
Yeah, because I'm probably not going to eat spleen, actually. I could be convinced to take a spleen supplement. I have a spleen supplement, actually. Okay, so then going back to what you were talking about earlier, those kind of damaging foods you mentioned, a lot of those were dairy products. And so I was wondering, are you meaning those are damaging to the spleen, in particular to the spleen, or just kind of to the body in general? Because I was thinking about, if we're talking about traditional Chinese medicine and how people of Asian descent are genetically prone to lactose intolerance. And so for them, dairy would generally not be helpful to the system, but like a good source of raw dairy could be very nourishing to other populations with that out that issue. So what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's completely individual. I feel like more and more people are dairy or lactose intolerant. And with the rising number of autoimmune diseases, you see that many of these people have leaky gut. So dairy and gluten can be very damaging. Some people are just genetically vulnerable to having immune cells activated by gluten or casein, causing more issues. So what's happening is these casein molecules leak from the gut and affect your immune system in the gut, in the brain cells. And with autoimmune, molecular mimicry is causing immune cells to attack both casein and myelin that surround nerve cells. They're very similar. So this contributes to things like multiple sclerosis, as well as people becoming sensitive to foods that, once never bothered them.
Yeah, that's true. True. Some people, if we look back at, leaky gut, people are going to become more and more sensitive, like gluten and dairy are the top two allergenic foods and something to eliminate from the diet. And sometimes, therapeutically for a short time, sometimes for longer. But yeah, in its real food form, I think they can be very nourishing for those people that can handle it.
For sure. I agree.
Okay, I wanted to also talk about meal timing because it's so fascinating to me how wildly this varies by culture. Biblically speaking, from what I found, the research I've done, the Israelites broke their fast mid to late morning with a very light meal, and then they had their largest meal of the day around sunset. And when they fasted, it was sunset to sunset. And ancient Romans had their first meal around sunrise, but it was very light. And their main meal was dinner, but it was a very early dinner, more like a late afternoon dinner. And so my experience over the years is that meal timing and when someone breaks a fast really depends on the person, and I know people have heard me say and give some general guiding principles like eat with the sun in the sun, or if someone has leptin resistance or in some cases nervous system dysregulation, to eat within an hour of sunrise and to have very consistent meal times. I also like breaking the fast by 10 a.m.-ish, so we can replenish those amino acids that the body used overnight for repair work. So I don't know. All that said, I was just curious about what your thoughts are around meal timing according to what you've learned in traditional Chinese medicine.
Yeah, I think the meal timing according to traditional Chinese medicine is energetically beneficial. Just knowing circadian rhythm and how light signals interplay with our hormones throughout the day. And in TCM, how that ebb and flow of energy affects each organ system in a 24-hour period. So just like eating seasonally signals the body, I feel that there is definitely healing qualities to eating according to when the energy peaks. So eating at between 7 and 11 a.m. gives you your peak energy between 9 and 11 for digesting your morning meal. So performing more difficult mental tasks or exercise that's an optimal time to do that. If, you're not hungry in the morning, that may be a signal of weakness or stagnation. Lunch, usually between 11 and 1, this is when the heart organ energy is at its peak, followed by the small intestine peaking at between 1 and 3. And this is when much of our nutrient absorption takes place. And then 3 to 5 p.m. is when the bladder peaks and metabolic waste is moved to the kidneys filtration system. And generally, you want to focus on a lighter dinner between 5 and 7 p.m., which is ideal. It's our kidney energy peaks at this time. So this is responsible for maintaining our youth and our vigor. And if you are stressed or working during these hours, maybe like something like miso soup to support adrenals and prevent adrenal fatigue might be a better idea.
Okay. Another thing that you said earlier that I absolutely love hearing about is this like seasonal aspect of strengthening the organs. So if you don't mind going into that a little bit, what does that look like practically? Because I'm familiar with spring being a time to focus on the liver, as it aligns with the plants that are available, herbs like dandelion and milk thistle and the bitter herbs that support bile flow. But what herbs align with the organs and the other seasons, and why are those seasons particular to those specific organs?
Yeah, great question. So the winter is the best time to strengthen the Chinese kidney and bladder because, that stores your essence or jing, and that rules birth, development, and, maturation. So for that, you want to look to warming, more stimulating circulatory herbs like ginger and cinnamon, ginseng and cordyceps strengthen the qi and help with fatigue, and walnuts are great for nourishing kidney strength. Other herbs I like to keep handy as well to support my immune system are garlic, onions, astragalus, and turmeric. Elderberry is wonderful, especially for children, and you can take that as a syrup combined with other herbs to help stave off colds. And as you mentioned, in the spring, we nourish the liver. So the liver is essential for the balance of qi, and the liver's blood is responsible for the repetitive cycles of human life. For example, a woman's menstrual cycle. In addition to the dandelion and milk thistle, chrysanthemum and goji berries support liver health, nourish the eyes. Mint promotes free movement of qi. Buplurum is one of the most important Chinese liver herbs as it destagnates and detoxifies the liver. And then in summer, this is a time to nourish and cool the heart and small intestine. So for that, you can use rose and jujube, which is calming and helps promote sleep. Green tea and jasmine help cool the body. And then in late summer, this is also a time to nourish the spleen. And we discussed ways to do that already, but also adding nutritive herbs like nettles is a wonderful way to get so many essential vitamins and minerals as well. And then last autumn, we focus on moisture and protection of the lungs and large intestine. So some beneficial herbs are astragalus root, and this one I often just use in a crock pot when making broths or soups. And this helps boost your immune system. Magnolia flower or sage can help open nasal passages and help with congestion.
I just love thinking about how God put all of these healing compounds in nature for us. And as I always say, he doesn't leave anybody out in the cold. So I think no matter where you are in the world, you can find things in your environment, right, that are going to be supportive of you during the season. It just blows me away when I think about that. It's very, very cool. How do you determine what herbs a person would need if you're working with them? What a person needs and what they would benefit from?
Yeah, there is a lot to consider when putting together an herbal protocol, aside from the intake, the consult, labs and all that. Every person has their own unique circumstance, and I cannot use the same combination of herbs for different people, even if their symptoms are similar. Herbs interact energetically different in each individual. And, I also have to consider drug interactions, allergy sensitivities, blood pressure. So getting as much information is critical to understanding how herbs will interact in a person. One of the really helpful tools I use is looking at the tongue body. So all the internal organs connect with the tongue and can indicate a long-standing issue as well as current imbalances. So it helps understand the patterns that the person is experiencing, and it's a useful tool in confirming a pattern I identify. So when coming up with the herbal protocol, especially in more complicated cases, I use herbs to support multiple body systems specific to that person. So in choosing herbs this way, ultimately you can impact the entire body and support more than just even 3 or 4 organ systems impacted by that imbalance. So generally, I will formulate a tincture and tea for long term, and for chronic issues, I'll keep the person on it for 4 to 6 months and then revisit everything.
Very cool. Okay, just what are some examples of just some things that you're looking for on the tongue?
Oh my goodness! So we look at the coating on the tongue. You look for cracks on the tongue, swelling on the tongue. Some people will have quivering on the tongue. You look at the color, like how pink is it? If it's purple, there's so many different things to look for. Teeth marks on the tongue. So it's intricate. It takes some learning, but it's honestly, the more I've looked at a million tongues, the more tongues I look at, the more fascinated I get. And, it's always an opportunity to learn a bit more about how, what you're seeing.
Well, looking at pictures of tongues sounds a lot better than looking at pictures of poop, which is what I have done. It sounds a little less scary. No, but I know Crystal was like, I'm working with Stacey and she's having me send pictures of my tongue and I don't know what she's doing. So maybe we can talk about that in a minute when we leave Crystal in. But before we go there, I'd love to know, what are your top 3 to 5 anchor herbs, if you will? The herbs that you kind of your go-tos that you use the most.
Oh my gosh, my anchor herbs. I have so many. I would say the ones that I use the most are nettles, yarrow, garlic, and medicinal mushrooms. Nettles is like kale on steroids. Nettles vitamin content is far superior. It's such a powerful superfood. It's nutrient dense, and it's actually one of the first herbs I hated because it stings. So the sting comes from the formic acid and histamine that's contained in these tiny little hairs of the leaf and stem. So if you've ever rubbed against a nettle plant, you just know. And, we have these everywhere on our property. So when my boys were little, they got stung often. So it was like the first plant I really had to learn quick. But the more I learned about it, the more I fell in love with it. And even though, having its presence on your property is an indicator of your soil quality. So it's been used as food and as an herb and fiber for thousands of years. And it helps with nutrient and protein assimilation. And the seeds are actually deeply nourishing to the kidneys and adrenals. Yarrow is up there. I use this all the time as a styptic because I'm accident prone. I'm always cutting myself either in the garden, and especially when I'm chopping herbs. So I can't tell you how many times this plant has kept me from getting stitches. So yarrow, it has many uses. It's anti-inflammatory, it's anti-spasmodic, it's diaphoretic. It's useful for IBS, especially with blood in the stools. And this is definitely an herb with countless uses. Another top herb I use is garlic. It's a powerful antibiotic and antiviral. I mean, garlic is one of the best plant sources of sulfur, and it's responsible for its medicinal effects. So the sulfur compounds emitted by garlic can kill bacteria and viruses, as well as disinfect the air, the body, and anything it pretty much comes in contact with. So interestingly, plants high in sulfur content like garlic, onions, and those in the cabbage family are useful in supporting autoimmune diseases. So the last herb I'll mention that I use daily are medicinal mushrooms. So like reishi, turkey tail, lion's mane, maitake, shiitake. They have so many health benefits. Interestingly, humans are more closely related to mushrooms than our plants. So we share similarities in intercellular signaling and metabolic pathways that aren't found in plants. Mushrooms are an excellent source of B vitamins, potassium, zinc, copper, and selenium, and they are a great source of vitamin D. And if you dry mushrooms with the gills face up and they're exposed to sunlight for several hours, the D content can increase up to 46,000 IUs, which blows me away.
Very cool.
So when you eat mushrooms, you get the whole package, all phytochemical constituents, along with fiber, polysaccharides, but just don't eat raw mushrooms because our stomachs cannot digest the chitins. They are rich in sulfur, and we know they contain beta-D-glucans and other components in the cell walls that stimulate natural killer cells, which help balance the immune system and are protective against cancer and autoimmune disease.
So we should never eat any kind of mushrooms raw?
No, you shouldn't.
Really? Okay,
I did not know this either until I went to in herbalism school, I used to eat raw mushrooms all the time. And I'm like, oh, that's a no-no.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. Okay. Good tip. Good tip. Now with the vitamin D content of mushrooms, is it vitamin D2, right? It's not D3. Isn't it D2?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. That's what I was thinking. But that's very cool when you put the gills up and expose it to sunlight, how it can absorb more of that. I love that.
Yeah. So when you buy mushrooms in the store, put them outside for a little bit.
I've got some in the fridge. I think I'll do that. Okay. So you've mentioned a few kind of different delivery systems. Does it matter particular to the herb, like using a tea versus a tincture versus a capsule?
Yeah, a delivery system can definitely make a difference in the effectiveness of many of the herbs. It really depends on the herb and their constituents. So some herbs lose a lot of their medicinal value when dried and are better used fresh and fresh when making an alcohol extract. So some herbs, like those that are rich in polysaccharides or like mucilaginous herbs and gums, are better used as a water-soluble extract, so like making a tea. And then there's a lot of phytochemistry involved, like alkaloids are very soluble in alcohol and not so much in water. And then your monoterpenes, which are, most of your essential oils, they're soluble in alcohol and somewhat in water. But some herbs like burdock root or dandelion root, they're decocted. I use a decoction method for them and it's just simmering an herb for like 30 minutes or more, because that really extracts more of the medicinal value out. So, plants are like people, they're complex. And, then when you talk about like standardized herbs like milk thistle, now the milk thistle has been studied at length. And so you can extract some herbs. There's a limited number of them, and they have been able to maintain the potency without manipulating the naturally occurring compounds. So you really, you need to know where the herbs are being sourced as well, and if they are, using sustainable methods, especially for plants that are on the high risk list. And you can find out which plants are high risk from the United Plant Savers. So when creating an herbal protocol, using the right combination of herbs helps promote synergy when making a tincture or tea. So herbs can be much more effective in doing this together and having a much bigger impact on the overall system.
When you say plants that are on the risk list, what does that mean?
So because, we're mass consumers, and, when people find out about plants, let's just say even, American ginseng, it was very plentiful in, South America. And it's become so over-harvested that it's hard to find. And so unless you're getting it from a grower who is, growing it specifically for medicine, you really don't want people out cultivating it in the wild. There's so many herbs that are close to extinct because we've just been over-harvesting them.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay. That's also interesting. Yeah. That sheds some light on, there's a lot of herbal tinctures that come in alcohol. And, I've gotten questions over the years, like, why is that? And they're, just that delivery system is specifically helpful for, I guess, those particular herbs. Interesting. Okay. I'd love to hear, along with, what you would recommending with herbs, the use of herbs and such, what kind of dietary advice are you giving people?
The best advice I would give is to eat for cellular health. Incorporate as many phytonutrients as you can. Antioxidant compounds from plants, they stimulate the production of enzymes in our cells that will neutralize free radicals before they can damage our cells. So antioxidants, we know, are the cleanup crew. There are thousands of articles that support the benefit of phytonutrients. So everything from antibiotic and antioxidant properties that can keep our blood vessels more elastic, help remove toxins, regulate aspects of the immune system, and improve brain function. So I would challenge people to get as wide a variety of herbs and plant species as you can in your diet. Eat a rainbow of colors. include herbs, spices, leafy greens, colorful vegetables, cruciferous vegetables, dark berries. So I think if you eat a diet heavy in leafy greens and non-starchy vegetables, again, the dark fruits and berries, pasture, wild raised or caught animal protein, incorporate your healthy fats like olive oil, avocado, then you'll begin to optimize your health. It's really about maximizing nutrition for your cells and mitochondria.
Oh, yeah. We love that mitochondria. I think, that's a perfect segue to talk about the school, because we start learning about the mitochondria in Module 1. And I can remember early on when we were going through Module 1, you were excited. So, we have our Zoom calls with our school classes on Monday. And I remember you piping in because you were writing your research paper on mitochondria for your Herbal program. And everything was just kind of jiving and coming together so well. And I loved when you would, kind of pipe in with that information. So let's talk about that. Why did you join the school when you were already, have this history, this education? You were also going through more herbalism education. So what led to that decision?
So many reasons, but the timing was completely God's. God knew I needed this program. I was always researching the healthiest diets, and there's just so much confusing information out there. I've struggled with food my whole life, especially after, I had a life-threatening episode of E. coli in my late 20s. It was very traumatic. I was refused to be admitted in the ER twice. I was told I had the flu. Finally, I got admitted because I couldn't keep anything down. I couldn't keep water down. There was literally blood coming out of both ends of me. So I was hospitalized for a week. I was misdiagnosed and sent home. So I've had a food phobia for decades since. So yes, I was already in a Herbal program working on my first research paper and coming out of a very difficult time in my life. God was working on me for the past year. I was finally dealing with a lot of varied emotions, childhood trauma, rebuilding my marriage and learning to let go and trust God. Well, my research I was working on was all about mitochondria and how it's the life force that influences our health. There's a quote, and I have a lot of quotes in my paper, but, one that I put right in the beginning of my paper by Robert Boyle says, "It's highly dishonorable for a reasonable soul living in so divinely built a mansion as the body she resides in to be so totally unacquainted with its exquisite structure." And he was one of the founders of modern chemistry, and his work was strongly influenced by his faith. And the second was, the greatest medicine of all is teaching people how not to need it. And we know that is a quote from Hippocrates. So my paper focused on the role of mitochondria and how disease begins at the cellular level, and how, like plants, when they don't get the proper nutrients to function properly and aren't protected from harmful toxins, they fail to thrive. So I was fascinated by the research and where the root of disease and disorder stems from, and how, everything we put in our bodies can feed health or disease, and how people were reversing disease and shrinking tumors and getting their life back through food. Food powers every cell, telling us the state of the outside environment, carrying details from which it came. And, no other physiological event has such astounding implications. It directly translates a chemical language from nature to the body. And I knew this from studying plants, that our bodies are intimately connected to Earth. So it is our source for everything we need to exist and thrive. So I realized herbs were just part of the equation, and I just wanted to know what to do. So how can God use me and everything I've learned to help others and honor him? And he just said prayer. But I kept praying, and I remember going up to someone who was very ill in my church and praying for them, for their health. And I just felt something overwhelming and just felt God's heart fill me. And, I joined an online prayer community, and, they would pray for me, I'd pray for them. And prayer really ultimately led me to the School of Christian Health and Nutrition. I was a vegetarian for many years. I did my best to get protein from other sources. I eat a clean whole food diet minus meat. I eat limited eggs, very little dairy. I have salmon once a week. And I remember one of my herb teachers say, take a course in nutrition. It's fundamental to everything. So writing my research paper, made me realize it was time. Yeah, I was looking for a Christ-centered school, and, your school, the School of Christian Health and Nutrition came up on my feed. So I prayed about it. I knew my husband would think I was crazy to sign up for another course, but I just couldn't ignore the feeling, and I had to do it. So once I started and realized prayer was central to every meeting, he showed me, prayer is medicine. Jesus is the master physician. And I knew this was where I was meant to be. And I had no idea this was going to be a stepping stone in navigating my own health journey. I often ignore my own health. And, I discovered by the end of the course that, what my body had been telling me all this time. And going through the school answered so many questions. It was aligned with everything I believed as to how we are to live in relation to creation, and offers so much research to back up everything, and just proves how awesome God's design is. So God gave me another word halfway through the course, and the word I kept hearing was autoimmune. And I asked the Lord, I said, is this what you want me to focus on? So, because many of my cases, including people I know, have autoimmune issues, but I just didn't know. So God was urging me to get my blood work done, and it's been 8 years, I'm embarrassed to say. So, and I was getting horrific migraines the past 4 years, and my energy plummeted in the last year. And I kept altering my diet, especially based on what I learned at the school. And, between that and fasting, I was having less frequent headaches, but I just wasn't feeling energized. And, even with adding animal protein, it's just, sometimes I would just feel worse. So, after a solid week of debilitating migraines, I figured, I got to make a radical change. And, sure enough, 2 weeks before graduating, I got my blood work back, and I was in complete shock. My cholesterol is extremely high. My LDL is high. Thankfully, my triglycerides were, low, and my good cholesterol is high. But, my vitamin D is deficient. I mean, I'm completely deficient in vitamin D. And so I requested a full thyroid panel based on my own facial and tongue signs, and found out I have hypothyroidism. So, I know diet, and I know lifestyle is powerful. Herbs are powerful, and God's giving me the tools to alter the course of my health.
Oh, so interesting. So what changes have you made in response to that information?
Well, based on what I've learned in the school, and, I'm kind of been studying Dr. Terry Wall's work, I'm embarking on a protocol to really increase nutrients in my diet. I wasn't eating nearly enough, twice a day, sometimes once a day. I'm focused on increasing my intake of variety of vegetables and colorful fruits. I'm shooting for 9 cups a day, no gluten or dairy, having 6 to 12 ounces of protein a day, sprouted nuts and seeds. I'm going to attempt the organ meat. I haven't tried it yet. It's a little leery, but, I'm so convinced, when you're so convinced that this is going to help your health, you're willing to do it. I just really want to give my cells the nutrients they're lacking. I'm creating my own herbal protocol to support my immune system and to support the areas of my body that have been suffering from deficiency. So, and that also includes some supplements. And, I'm going to stay on that for 3 to 4 months, get my labs reevaluated, and go from there.
Sounds like a great plan. Okay, I want to loop Cristal in here. Cristal, are you still there? Yeah. Okay, good. Because as we're kind of moving toward, we're talking about the school, talking about these changes, and you've been working with Cristal as her CHP and herbalist, which is just so awesome. So I want to take this opportunity to talk about the dynamic of the mentor study groups that we have in the school, which is how you two became connected. We have a handful of CHP graduates who lead a monthly small mentor study group. Carly and I, obviously, we have our weekly class calls with all the students, but then the mentor groups are an opportunity for our students going through the program to get extra support, ask curriculum and business questions, get to know some of their fellow students in a smaller, more intimate setting. So, Cristal, I'd love for you to talk more about that, the mentor groups, and then tell us what led you to reach out to Stacey for help.
Sure. So in the School of Christian Health and Nutrition, we have the smaller groups within the larger class of students, and they're created to give the students a smaller community to fellowship and get insight from one of the school's alumni. And it ends up that in these smaller groups, the students really connect and get to know one another on a deeper level, which usually carries them past graduation and into even launching their businesses or just practicing being a Christian health practitioner formally or with friends and family. So I have the privilege of getting to be a mentor in these groups, and I get to know the students much better through them regularly interacting with us there in the Zoom calls. So it was there that I met Stacey and really got to know her over the course of those 10 months that we met together. So in regard to reaching out to Stacey, it was late December of last year, and I was reinfected with COVID, which re-triggered Epstein-Barr virus and POTS in me again. And so Carly Bayless is my nurse practitioner. And I told Carly, God is really telling me to lean toward herbs. Like Stacey heard words like prayer, I heard herbs. I just kept hearing herbs. And so I grew up with a dad who was very much into herbal remedies, and I learned this at a young age. So, I was then very deep back then, like into herbal remedies with my own children. I would frequent the local mom and pop herb store regularly. But as I grew in my natural wellness journey, I kind of veered away from that simplicity of the plants in the form of like tinctures and teas, and I moved toward the appeal of encapsulated solutions. And while there really is a place and a time for targeted, well-formulated supplements, I slowly realized that I had drifted from that quiet wisdom that first drew me to natural wellness in the first place. And I'm a nervous system coach, and I teach people to slow down and simplify as a path to regulation and healing. So returning to that simplicity of herbs felt deeply aligned with what I already preach and practice. So, like I said, I'd already gotten to know Stacey in our school group, and I had seen how considerate and humble she was, but also so studious and brilliant, as everyone just found out. So my nervous system really needed safety during that reinfection. I'm, struggling to recover from illness, and Stacey felt really safe to me after getting to know her for those 10 months. And what I mostly mean by safe is there can be a lot of uncomfortable religious woo in the herbal world. And I didn't have the mental bandwidth to navigate that. I just needed someone who delivered the meat without the bones. So it was just a no-brainer for me to reach out to her to ask for her help. And she listened deeply to my story. She considered it from like her unique herbal angle. And this card blew me away. I just have to share this. So in going through my initial intake, I told her that I've had an aversion to eating animal for honestly as long as I can remember, even childhood. And I've sought therapy, counseling. I thought I had an eating disorder, and I was open about it. I shared, and I just tried to get help with my anti-animal thing. And Chelsea, you probably remember this being an issue with me in the Christian Health Club, because I was telling everybody. I just felt like I needed to get past this aversion. And I would even think that the chicken I was buying was bad. And I would just assume that it was kind of in my head, but not in a derogatory way. Like I just thought I had some kind of disorder. But see, she revealed to me it was not in my head. So she can explain this, but my instinct was telling me that it wasn't supportive for me with Epstein-Barr virus. And there's something about arginine that Stacey can explain that too if she wants to. But it's not that other practitioners didn't know this or that anyone had failed to help me. I probably just told Stacey something at just the right time that I'd never told anyone before. But it's that she prayerfully considered my situation and explored the possibilities. And then she was able to connect the dots for me that literally set me free. So, now she's my herbal CHP. And we're just slowly and patiently working on things alongside other, like I have Carly, I have an acupuncturist, but Stacey has just been such a breath of fresh air and has brought me so much freedom. Truly. Thank you, Stacey.
You're welcome.
I loved it. I love it. Yeah, it's so interesting because, Crystal's in the Christian Health Club and has been sharing with us for some time about her aversion to meat. I mean, originally, I think when you came to the club, like you added more meat in, like you got more protein heavy, right? But then you've had this series of infections that kind of get reinfected with COVID and such. And so it's a little bit of a moving target. But anyway, we have been with Crystal following her journey of her meat aversion. And so when she met with you, Stacey, that first time, she was excited to share that, you were making this connection, that you had this answer, that she shared how you are personalizing her overall protocol, giving her answers to this, this meat aversion, using pictures of her tongue and, creating these formulas and mailing them to her. And so just such fascinating stuff. And so I'd love to know more about that. So will you just kind of explain it from your side, how you have seen and been working with Crystal?
Yeah, of course. Every person has a unique set of circumstances, and every situation is a chance to learn more. And that being said, I am wildly curious about each client and what is happening in their body. What is their story? Why, for example, does Crystal have an aversion to meat? What is the tongue revealing? There are so many outward signs, even down to the lines on your face, to the health of your nails that tell your story. So I took a deep dive into EBV. And in my research, I discovered that EBV citrullonates arginine and can trigger joint, thyroid, liver, or neurological or multiple food reactivity. So even though we need arginine for viral replication with EBV, this process affects the protein structure and function as it is associated with certain autoimmune conditions. So there is a lot to be said about listening to your body. So based on all the information I've been gathering from Crystal and the complexities of her situation, this gives me guidance as to what herbs to put together to begin rejuvenating our system over time. So herbs that affect the HPA axis, the nervous system, immune and digestion are areas I like to consider. And some of the herbs I would have chosen, Crystal mentioned that, she's got a sensitivity to. So it's really an art form in a way. We may have to make adjustments in the beginning, and it really depends on what her body may tell us. Herbs take time. Healing takes time. Food is another major element we have to navigate, especially with her sensitivities. I have to be sure she's getting appropriate nutrients to feed her cells and that her body is effectively, eliminating waste. So I usually use teas and tinctures, based on what the client is most willing to do. And, it's all based on their taste. And so thankfully, Crystal's great. She doesn't care what it tastes like. So it gives me just so many more options for herbs.
Okay. So I want to know, what was something that you could tell on Crystal's tongue? And then, because I know Crystal doesn't care if you tell us. And then what's one of the herbal remedies or an herb that you're using with her?
Well, I just noticed on her tongue, there's purple. So there's not, things aren't moving. Things are, stagnant. And, part of, some of the herbs, especially with her autoimmune issues, right away, I'm thinking mushrooms because, and I know she has had some concern about, mold toxicity, but, mushrooms aren't mold. They're actually used quite often for, situations like hers. I myself use medicinal mushrooms. They're powerful medicine for autoimmune conditions. They're great, like lion's mane is amazing, neurotropic, she's got a lot of brain fog. So, there's, those are at the top of my list. I have several others to address, other things that are going on with her, but those are just a few.
Very.
And my tongue quivered. Or my tongue quivered.
Yes, her tongue quivered as well. So, that shows signs of severe imbalance in her body. It's, it's also, related to like liver wind, and, it's another Chinese term. Like when you think about wind, you think about how the wind moves the trees. So you're seeing things being very, when you have quivering or just like, people have spasms or something, that's wind in the body. So there's too much of that going on, and it's just causing all these imbalances that are happening in her, which are obvious. She's been struggling with a lot of different issues. So, yeah.
Very fascinating. Cristal, anything else on your end that you think would be interesting to add here?
What I just love is that she's doing things in like these layers. And I do think if you go this route, you just need to be ready to go slowly and trust the wisdom of the herbalist that's helping you, instead of just, because I said, and then can we work on my heart? And Stacey's like, whoa, your tongue is quivering, girl. Like, so, I mean, it just is a slow process, but I just think that goes back to just the way God created things, and we just need to trust and work slowly. And so I'm so thankful for that. But yeah, I don't understand it all. I'm just trusting Stacey at this point.
Stacey, I remember one time in class, you said that the line, when you have a line between, like the wrinkle line between your eyebrows, because I have this
too,
is a sign of a liver issue, right? Did I make that up? You said that, right?
Yes, I did. I have that too. I learned facial lines from Marty Flint. It fascinates me, and then I'll just give you another one. I know I shouldn't give all my secrets out because people are going to be like looking at their lines freaking out. And I'm like, but some lines can go away. I mean, that's the beauty of it. Some don't. So like I have a liver line. Some people will have two lines, they'll have one here and one here, and that's that's gallbladder. So, when people are galled, they're, that expression. I have worry lines. So like I'll have little line here, and those are worry lines. There's lines, you get lines on your ears, and those are, have to do with, your heart and your kidneys. So, I mean, I'm truly, truly blown away by, it's like rings on a tree, right? You can tell the season a tree's been in by the rings on a tree. And you can tell that on your face too, like that's your life story. And I don't think it's a bad thing, but that's just, it's an expression of who you are and what's going on with you.
Yeah. Well, if you've got your liver line or your gallbladder lines, there you go. There's a little tip. Might need to work on those with some herbs. This is so fascinating. Okay. So what if somebody wanted to start by like learning more about herbalism? Do you have any good book recommendations? I would love to know what they are.
Oh my gosh, there's too many because I'm a nerd, but I would say like if you're more of a kitchen herbalist and you just want to start incorporating herbs for your family, herbs into your cooking, herbs into your tea, I would say most any of Rosemary Gladstar's herbal books are excellent. Also, I have a book that I love by Rosalie de la Forêt. It's called Wild Remedies. And I know she came out with another book. I apologize, I don't remember the name of it. She's excellent too. And if you want a little more sciencey back books, there's a book called Adaptogens by David Winston, who's actually one of my teachers right now. There's a great book called Southern Folk Medicine by Phyllis Light. So those are a few. One of my first books that I got was called Back to Eden by Jethro Klaus. That's excellent also. And I would say, another thing I was going to mention that every year is the herbalists have an herbal conference, which they offer for free for people. And it really gives you kind of like a nice idea of what different herbalists do and specialize in and really what the field's all about. And then if you really want to get your feet wet, I would say Herbal Academy. That's where I started. So they will offer like workshops mini courses if you just want to take bite-sized courses, all the way to clinical programs. So those are just some of the resources I would recommend.
Oh, very, very cool. Okay, well, I guess we'll wrap it up here. But before I let you go, I have to ask you the anchor questions. So what is your anchor meal?
And not surprisingly, a big leafy salad. A lot of greens, a lot of colors, especially from my garden in the summer. I mean, I can't ask for anything better than that. And I like to have, wild caught salmon on the side. I like olive oil and balsamic vinegar all over the top of it. And I'm in heaven.
Sounds very refreshing. Okay, what about an anchor verse?
My anchor verse that just keeps me going is keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life, from Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23.
I love that. That's a beautiful one. This has been so incredible, Stacey. And thank you, Cristal, for coming in for support and letting us use you as a little case study and talk about your quivering tongue and such. I just think it helps really illustrate the kind of work that Stacey's doing and just this incredible just synergy, and again, just giving God glory for all of the beautiful things he's put into creation and also just the way he's made us all come together in this school. My heart is just incredibly, just so grateful and overwhelmed by the blessings of it. So thank you both for being here today.
You.
Hey, Stacey, before we go, I'd love for you to tell people where they can connect with you to learn more. Maybe they want to work with you as their herbalist CHP, as Cristal put it. So where could they go for that?
Yeah, my website is herbalchp.com, and you can find me on Instagram at Prov Herbs Garden. It's, Prov Herbs with an H. And I'm not big on posting, but I do post occasionally, so you can follow me there.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks, you guys. So good to be with you. And thank you, everybody, for listening. I hope you have a healthy and blessed week, and I will talk to you soon.